ambulatory applications of place-based education. So place is kind of one of my big things. And so the format of this panel is conversational. So we've decided to structure the conversation around really 3 central questions, specifically about diversity in the outdoors and in our parks, and racial diversity in the outdoors and the parks. And so I'm kind of functioning as the moderator, although of course I'll be jumping in and out, sharing pieces of my experience. And so these panelists, who I'm going to let introduce themselves in just a second, they are 3 of my favorite people in the world. So I'm the one who created the panel and chose to invite them onto it, because I think it will be super enlightening to put these folks and myself in conversation with each other. And that being said, I was the one who made like all the connections between the work that they do. And that's not necessarily true for how they see themselves. And I think it will be just as important for you, the audience, as it will be for me to see the differences and the uniqueness of each of the panelists. And so that's really something I'm looking forward to. So now we'll just take a few minutes to give each panelist a chance to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about the work that they do. Can we start with Jasmine?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Tom, thank you for inviting me here and having me here tonight, and to the Adirondack Experience. Thank you for even holding a series like this. It's really important. I'm an attorney, civil litigator, and I've recently founded a company called the Hood Hikers, which is a hiking and day trip venture which attempts to bring people from the city and from different parts of New York City out into nature in the tri-state area. And I'm just happy to be here tonight to discuss this topic.
Awesome. Simone?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Hi, everybody. My name is Simone. I go by all pronouns, she, her, he, him, they, them. I am a youth development expert and an anti-racist community organizer from New York City on occupied Lenape land. I facilitate workshops on racial inequity for different organizations. And now I'm starting my own startup as well called ORS, where I contract grassroots organizers and activists to have these conversations in spaces such like this. So looking forward to extending my work outside of here. I've been able to work with the American Camping Association and the New York State Outdoor Education Association as well. And currently I serve on the board of experience camps and super excited to start this conversation.
Awesome, thank you, Simone. And Neil?
Twant, Skanaha, Gata, Dequiti, Adisna, Waknana, Skaruda, Equahea, Gayadakra. My name is Neil Patterson Jr. I was born into the White Bear clan of the Tuscarora Nation, which is a member nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Some of you might know it as the Iroquois Confederacy. I have been working with the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force for many years and serve as Assistant Director at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York, or what we like to call in Onondaga territory. Thank you for all joining, Yawa, Scano, and greetings to all of our guests today. Yawa.
Awesome, thank you, Neil. So once again, I just would like to extend my gratitude to all 3 panelists. I think it's this is a huge benefit to the world to be able to see you all in conversation with each other. So with that, let's kind of jump into our discussion. And so we will, some of us have prepared some answers to these questions. I think we're also expecting to be able to respond to each other. So we'll kind of play that one a little bit by ear. But our first question is, we really wanted to think about why right, what are some of the explanations for why the use of federal and state wilderness areas are dominated by white people, right? Statistically, by a lot of metrics, we see that the use of these areas really is dominated by white folks. And so to start this one off, Simone, I know you had a couple of slides potentially for this question. Could you start us off with those? And then we can kind of snowball off of that.
Yes, thank you. So let me just quickly share my screen. So I really love this question, and I'm definitely a researcher, so I went into like my rabbit hole when it came to this question as well. And I think on the backdrop of this conversation, I think we have to think about not only why white folks are dominating these spaces, but also what prevented access for people of color. So I wanted to talk about the racist beginnings of our national parks. A lot of the conservationists of this time definitely had racist rhetoric. We have John Muir, Madison Grant, and Gifford Pinchot. Muir was quoted with using the word Sambos when referring to African Americans. Madison Grant used literature that was used by Hitler, and Pinchot also engaged in conversations around eugenics. So right there, you already know that our parks were created with the mindset of Black and brown folks not having access to these spaces. So of course, a lot of these ideologies are gonna trickle down into our national parks today, how we approach it, who has access to it, who feels welcome, etc. And I wanted to give a really short historical context, just 3 dates. This is not a lot, but I wanted to start with 1865, with the end of Jim Crow, which is a legal segregation of folks, of Black and white folks. In 1865. On the backdrop of that, we have our national parks being opened in 1916 at the same time that segregation was happening. So we have these parks being open with folks having to enter these spaces, seeing whites only signs and seeing lackluster spaces for folks who identify as Black and brown. So continuing this history, which is not so long ago. And even in 1945, when our parks were desegregated, a lot of these changes took years to even feel the impacts on the ground. Especially during Jim Crow, Black and brown folks, in particular Black Americans, had to face the very real fear of attacks to their bodies, to their minds in the woods. So we have this historical memory and historical trauma of what it looks like to be in these spaces, especially with the racist beginnings. And in this current context, there are myriad of reasons that keep us out of these spaces, but I really wanted to provide this context to know that there is this historical space of why folks have not had access to our national parks. And I really found this quote super important too, to think about bringing the indigenous context to talk about national parks and the conservation movements were created as a way for people to escape during the Industrial Revolution. In many ways, they are created by removing indigenous peoples from those lands and creating refuges for more affluent white people to get away from the city, which were becoming more Black and brown. So this settler colonialist perspective of taking indigenous land, stepping away from Black and brown mentality in our cities and using it as a refuge for white affluent folks, and how a lot of those traditions and customs and narratives are still present today. Just a couple more things. The historical fear that I talked about, especially with the Fugitive Slave Act, where folks, Black slaves were actually captured in the woods, and how that historical memory is still in our bodies, and we're still trying to unlearn that now. And also representation is super key, especially with media representation. Growing up, I rarely saw Black women in the woods being represented, and if I can't see it, it's really hard for me to imagine myself in that space. Luckily, I had spaces like camp where I was able to see other folks of color engaging in this work, but without that representation, it was really hard to see myself in the great outdoors, as they call it. Also, we have to think about marketing. Are we marketing in low-income communities of color in languages that are accessible outside of English? And thinking about representation of leadership in the woods as well. Having Black rangers or Black outdoor educators is super important. And I'll pause here to let my other panelists go, but I just wanted to give that historical context for this conversation.
So So I'll pick up from where Simone left off. Each of those points that she touched on, I had written a little bit about. Accessibility. Now I'm going to speak on the perspective of Black and Brown people from the city, particularly from the 5 boroughs in New York City, Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the other boroughs. But no disrespect or shade to them. But the accessibility is an issue. Simone spoke about being exposed to the outdoors in camp, and a lot of people don't have that option out here. And it is an issue of comfort for them. One, if they can get to the nature and to the parks, if they do have some way of getting out there, they're not comfortable navigating the woods, navigating this unfamiliar territory when there's no one that looks like them out there. And then there's the issue of their behavior. How do they enjoy the nature space, which I think we're going to touch on another question. But Simone touched on some really important aspects like media and advertising. A lot of times we're not seeing Black and Brown people in advertisements. We're not seeing us portrayed in a positive light outdoors. And so it's very unfamiliar to us. And then that also is the underlying issue behind the stereotype that a lot of people from the city, when we tell someone, hey, we're going hiking, we're doing this, we're doing that, oh, that's white people stuff. Like there's an actual stereotype that is what white people do, and that Black and Brown people do not enjoy these activities. And so we have a lot of obstacles and barriers in the way, and that cause these areas to continue to be dominated by white people.
Nyala, Jasmine, and Simone, yeah, that's you're touching on many of the triggers, the sentiment, the feelings we share as disadvantaged, as they say, disadvantaged populations. Without going too far into the history of how these wilderness areas were created, I think it's worth trying to understand a little bit about some of the language that's used in the terminology around wild areas, wilderness, the myth of the pristine, and the frontier mentality that I think goes along with the use of and management and access to this territory. For Indigenous people, you know, it's definitely a nuanced thought process compared to our other brothers and sisters of color in the world. And I would say that, you know, one of the things that comes up the most in our communities is, as Simone mentioned, the sort of the stigma associated with, well, that's what white people do, but also this land, these wilderness areas are directly linked to the dispossession of that land, of those places, especially when you look at national parks in the American West, from Indigenous people taken by the United States or their colonial allies. And I think that's a hard thing to do, is right to think about returning to a place that has been taken from you. Not only in terms of just the historical trauma, as Jasmine and Simone have mentioned, but also just in terms of how you relate to that place going forward, right? This notion of wilderness, of the wild, ironically enough, is often associated with this fanciful notion of what it means to be Native American. We see this all over in national parks out west, where there are indigenous words and languages being used to give visitors the sense of a pristine wilderness area. And I think this theft of intellectual property that occurs in wilderness areas goes hand in hand with just a complete ostracization of Indigenous people from their original territories. So again, without going too far into history, I think that's worth maybe another webinar to think about Indigenous dispossession of territory and its psychological and social and economic impacts on today's Indigenous peoples. But for now, let's just say it's really hard to return to a home that's been stolen from you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for that perspective too. I really appreciate you sharing that. And it really hit me to hear you speak on it, so thank you. And Jasmine, I wanted to also speak to what you said around access and representation, and the fact that in my reflection now and thinking about all my experiences with the outdoors, with hiking, with nature, have been in proximity to whiteness. So the ability for me to go to camp when I was younger was because I was able to get on scholarship from someone who was more privileged than me. The fact that I'm currently, like, when I do go to the woods now is because of my proximity to white folks and my relationships and what that looks like. And even when I did go to the great outdoors, as they say, it would always be led by white men in particular. So always knowing that I'm a passive participant instead of an active participant in these spaces too, and how that impacts my view of it. And the way that perspective shifted actually was when I went on one of your hikes, which I hope you get to talk about, where you were the first Black woman who took me into the woods. And imagine having that as a young person, growing up with the innate love for a love of nature in my own neighborhood and outside of it, what that would have done for me and my relationship to the outdoors. So thank you for bringing that up too.
Thank you so much for saying that. That was really impactful. I mean, that's what we really want to do with the Hood Hikers, is to give these kids an opportunity to be in nature and be themselves in nature, and have a safe space for them to experience it on their terms without having to be triggered by the people who are in charge around them.
Awesome. So these are all fantastic points, and I'll kind of make my point as a way of shifting us into the second part of our discussion and the second question. Right. So there is, Simone and Jasmine, I feel like we're both saying really important things about, like, wilderness has impact on urban development, really. Like, there's a relationship that between these things that's grounded in, like, when we value one thing, that has implications for the thing that's opposite it, right? When we value wilderness, that means something for urban development, and it's had impact on policy. And I know Jasmine and Simone talked a ton about safety and accessibility, because it's, these barriers are really, they're more than economic. I mean, it's really important to address economic reasons why folks can't get out into the outdoors. But it's more than that, right? The safety, there's a sense of safety and values involved there. And then Neil brings up this fantastic point, which is just that some of our most beloved wilderness parks, Yosemite, Yellowstone, some of these big ones were literally created via the removal of Indigenous folks, right? So to construct wilderness, so we had to kind of construct wilderness in these places, you had to remove people, because wilderness doesn't have people in it. So that means that wilderness is kind of a myth in this way, right? Which really reminds me of something that Jasmine said, which is, like, there's a stereotype that among folks of color that some of this stuff is white people stuff, right? And although that's can be a problematic stereotype, perhaps some of this stuff is white people stuff, right? Perhaps some of this wilderness stuff comes from a set of values that aren't universal. And that's kind of what we wanted to spend the rest of the conversation talking about. So our second question is does racial identity impact relationship to the outdoors? So I'll let anybody who wants to answer that one first. Go ahead.
So I'll begin there, and I'll just jump into, again, how it's kind of a two-pronged thing. It's racial identity, and it's also cultural, because, under your race, you're going to have different cultures that do have different relationships to the outdoors. For instance, me being Puerto Rican from the Bronx, my relationship with outdoors, even though I may not see others that look like me out there, may be different from a Black American person, which may be different from someone, an African immigrant who's now in the United States. So it's kind of, it overlaps with your culture, but absolutely it impacts our relationship because Black and brown people overall at the moment have kind of a like awkward new dating phase relationship kind of going on right now. Like we're starting to get back into it, and we are bringing the attention and focus on how do we get more Black and brown people into the wilderness. But it involves a lot of different steps, but it does impact our relationship in as far as our comfort in nature, as far as what we enjoy to do outdoors. Maybe it might look a little different from us. For instance, when we went hiking for the hood hikers, we're out there, we're dancing, we're singing, we're being free. We're letting our inner child free because we can't do that in the rat race of New York City every day. We have to be stoic, we have to be vigilant, we have to be on guard. And when we are out in nature and we feel safe, we're able to let all of that go. And I can't speak to how, other racial or how white folks enjoy the outdoors.
Thanks, Simone. That was great. And trust me, I've been there with a group of Native young people, and feeling conflicted at times because there were white folks around us who were there to enjoy a particular brand of, as Tommy says, wilderness, a brand of whiteness, with a serene, quiet atmosphere. And we pierced that with our shouts and our yells and our singing, and just reestablishing ancient relationships with place. And it actually, at times, has caused me to think, well, is this what we did in the past? Were we this loud? I don't know. But I would want to respond to this question by really saying that it shouldn't matter. There should be no difference, because many of the teachings that we have as Indigenous people on Turtle Island talk about this as a human right? That this relationship that humans have is one of both necessity, but also reciprocity, respect, of right relationship with place, with our animal, with our flora and our fauna, relatives that are supporting us. All people, regardless of identity, depend on the earth, right? This is what is sort of taught in basic science, and yet we continue to create a commodity of land and to create a commodity of these plants and of these animals. And I just would stress that, all human beings are people of the earth. And that's what we need to be thinking about in our larger relationship. Oren Lyons, who's a wonderful teacher and mentor of mine, has many times said, how do we teach 7 billion people, soon to be 8 billion people, about their relationship to the earth, right? So he doesn't say, how do we teach one race or another? It's this notion that human beings were given everything that they need to thrive on this planet. And it's our goal to think about how we do that.
Thank you. I'll jump in here. So I definitely think that my racial identity impacts my relationship to the outdoors. And I know in a later question or conversation, we'll talk about the ways that it does so positively. But for me, I'll talk about the ways that it negatively has impacted me. I think we have to talk about how whether, even though Jim Crow is over, there is still this lingering sentiment of a whites-only narrative when it does come to the woods. And it shows up definitely when I'm out there in different spaces. There's a consistent fear in the back of my head of racially motivated attacks. And we know in this country it's very hard to get accountability when it comes to that. So I always have to be protective of my body and have this double consciousness when I am in the woods and how I comport myself. I also have to be super careful to kind of code switch in a way where I don't bring attention to myself, where I don't bring attention to the point where I have to have any kind of interaction with the state and law enforcement, with the rangers in particular who are overwhelmingly white, because that can be a super triggering experience. I have to also deal with the impact of seeing white folks in the woods and always feel like there's this question in the back of their head about, what are you doing here? Do you know what you're doing? Also being mindful of the gear that I'm wearing, if it's not up to date, if I'm wearing just regular sneakers and jeans and a shirt and hiking, that perception of my knowledge and space in the woods as well. I have to constantly think about how I feel like an imposter in the woods because I didn't have access to adequate outdoor education from very young. So not being able to name a tree or a mushroom or a particular species in the woods, making me feel like I don't belong there and that I don't have access to this knowledge of nature that I'm in. Always being like a passive learner, questioning myself when I lead. It's a very different experience when I do go out, especially as a Black woman, and only really truly feel safe when I am in proximity to whiteness, when I am in the woods. But I do want to start switching that narratives, and I've been extremely impacted by folks like Jasmine who are leading hood hikers or outdoor Afro, and having these all Black spaces where we can go out and have a space of healing, of accountability, of seeing ourselves in these leadership roles. So I want to step away from this narrative as a victim of the outdoors and reclaiming that it is my right to be in this space, that I can feel comfortable, that I do know what I'm doing, whether I'm just hiking or not, like that is enough. And yeah, I'm really excited about the future of these conversations and how we make all folks of different intersectional identities feel safe. For me, because I've had access for so long, that I've gained comfort. I know how to walk to the side. I know how to speak to folks in the woods, which is something I shouldn't even have to do. But how do we make space for my family who comes from a low-income community who doesn't have the same social capital that I've had from very young to be comfortable in the woods too? So until we get to that space that we can bring in all folks with different intersectional identity along race lines, class lines, disability, gender, etc., then we can't do that. I think the future of our parks depends on us solving this issue.
Cool. So I feel like we're chomping at the bit for our third question, and we're kind of mixing it in there. So I think we'll kind of move in that direction. But I'll just respond a little bit with some of my perspective, and actually, really, this is a piggyback off of what Simone said, and really off of what Simone does, because Simone and I met over a decade ago working at a youth development organization for youth living below the poverty line in New York City and Madison County, New York. And so as like the wilderness person there, as one of the big wilderness people there, I feel extremely lucky to be in that situation, that I really never had like a classic, a more traditional outdoor education experience as an outdoor education leader, because it really questioned me. These youth in particular have really forced me to question my values when it comes to the outdoors. But I'll share one quick thing. Simone was talking a lot about like safety and even how microaggressions in the outdoors can really compromise that feeling of safety frequently. And our youth get that all the time, even from folks who are, actually mostly from folks who are super well intentioned, you can say, right? So they're very excited to see Black and brown kids in the woods. They're excited that we're there. But we encounter a lot of folks who assume that this is their first, that this is our youth's first time in the woods, and they kind of enter this role, and their language very much dictates or comes from this place of gatekeeping. And I know I've definitely done that as well, particularly when I started working for this organization. I was kind of a gatekeeper for what, right? And really for some of these wilderness ideas. And when I started to see that like gatekeeping and really started to question some of that, it got me to a much different place. It got me to a whole different curriculum really in my outdoor education. And so that I'd just like to introduce our kind of our third question now, which is really again.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Simone.
How did you see the young people's racial identity impact how they were in the woods when you were doing that work?
Yeah, well, so it's a fantastic question. It's a little bit part of my answer to the third question, but let's do it now. So I this is kind of what I'm all about these days. Is this particular experience? I would say the first thing is that it really questioned these youth really challenged the goals I had originally set for the program, because the goals I originally set were like conquer the mountain, have this experience and like fall in love with the challenge and the pristineness of the wilderness, right? See this space as this like beautiful, pristine, challenging landscape that we need to have as little impact on as possible, right? We need to preserve it as it is so that we can continue to challenge ourselves, right? That we need this escape from the city. We need this escape from like the luxuries of life in order to do this. And every step of the way, I feel like these youth were challenging that idea, right? We're challenging this idea that you need to get into the wilderness to challenge yourself in a healthy way, right? They were getting things. I was constantly getting this sense that they were getting things from this that were not part of my goals, right? That were separate. And so when I started to see that, when I started to get into a little bit more of the research, and this eventually became the subject of my dissertation, I started to develop curriculum that allowed them to inscribe more of their values and the environmental perspective that they bring from who they are into the program. So we started talking a lot more about kind of the myth of wilderness, right? The removal of indigenous folks. We started talking about environmental justice. We started talking about inequity in the outdoors. And I think that frame, especially justice, is something that's missing from a lot of outdoor education curriculum and just the outdoor industry up until very recently. The last few months seems like it's exploding the notion of justice. And so once I started putting that as a value into the program, I started to see the youth respond a lot more to that. Once justice became like a goal or an objective of my program, then youth started to meet my goals and objectives, right? That was a value that was missing that really needed to be there. So that brings up, going into our third question, do white people want something different from the outdoors than other folks? And do white folks marginalize others by enforcing these values?
Hi, Tommy. I'll start with that, and what I would say is it's really not the question of do white people want certain things. It in fact is the reality that white people have certain things. White people have complete control and access to well over 90%, if not much closer to 100%. I don't have the statistic, but it would be interesting for this Adirondack Diversity Initiative to do a little analysis and to really look at land ownership in the Adirondack Park. We look at the work by Leah Penniman at Soulfire Farm and other folks in the BIPOC community who are saying, listen, this is about re-examining the true story of these places, of this land. And boy, this was my first experience, and I just want to share a couple of quick photos because it happens to be actually the 10-year anniversary for me of one of the first experiences that I had in the Adirondack Park 10 years ago. And this was one of our first trips up in the Eastern High Peaks Wilderness, bringing young Native youth, young Haudenosaunee people from across the state to a place that was that had a lot of rules and regulations. This was a reacquaintance. This was an act of revival, cultural restoration, if you will, to place our boots and our feet on the ground that our ancestors once walked. And this short story here is that in our way, in our tradition, one of the things that we do when we camp together, both as an act of ceremony, but as an act of common sense, is to start a fire. And this was a fire that was eventually the subject of some controversy. And Adirondack, New York State DEC park ranger came across us and said, you know, you need to put out that fire. And this is one of our Oneida participants, De Gatlios, who stood up and said, you know what? We have very unique relationships with this place that extend beyond the history of New York State as an entity and beyond the creation of the United States of America. And we were able to really talk with this person, who again was a white person, and to try to share in our way our relationship to the land. We have since gone on to continue to revive and restore our cultural practices like gathering medicine, and focusing on an interesting aspect of Haudenosaunee identity, which is better sort of dealt with in a recent book by Susan Hill called The Clay We Are Made Of. And it is really about our relationship to territory, to our human and non-human relatives in these territories as one being of one family, right? Being of one human family across the land, and the really unique importance of clay and about the ground that we are standing on. And so it was this picture just last year where we had some young Haudenosaunee people actually visit some archaeologically sensitive sites in the Adirondack Park and come home. Right, it started off by talking about, well, are you comfortable visiting a home that was stolen for you? Well, we're taking it back. We're coming back, and this is part of the way in which we begin to do that. And I realize there's a question in the chat box about how do we reprogram, or how do we create this imaginary in our youth, in our constituents to get back to the land? Well, it's participatory. It is about creating new relationships with the land, in this case clay, but also in the case of our human and non-human relatives like medicine and food. So I hate to turn that question on its end, but I do think it's worth saying, you know, white people have what they want right now. And there's a change that is coming. And hopefully we see that expressed, not in terms of just education and management, right? Because that's always the issue. Well, if we invite everybody up here, there's going to be overuse and there's going to be this negative impact. And how we handle that is through education and management, right? We develop management plans that say you can't build a fire, that you can have a group size of only 8, that horses are allowed here and ATVs are allowed here, but humans aren't allowed here. That is coming from a worldview. That's coming from a mindset about what land means to people. And that is what ultimately needs to be shifted.
Neil, that is that's all fantastic point. And we did also, we kind of set Neil up to say that. We kind of structured the question for that response. And I think it was said so beautifully. Neil also brought up one of the audience questions, which I would actually like to introduce now. I think we can start weaving in some of these questions now that there's about 15 minutes left. Before we do that, I just wanted to also quickly acknowledge that I talked about before how I put justice back into my outdoor education program in my work, and that had a big impact. But doing all that, I also decentered like the rigor and the challenge of the wilderness and recentered the environmental relationships and the reciprocity. Really, that Neil. So Neil was one of my teachers for quite a number of years, and really took some of that frame of relationships and reciprocity as an alternative to like the pristine challenge of the wilderness. And putting that into the program, right? Focusing on how my students are relating to the entities of nature. Really on a personal level, also had an enormous impact on bringing those youth in. Now, the question that Neil was referencing, I think it's such a wonderful question. We're going to kind of challenge it, so I'm bringing it up because I think there's something in it that we will challenge, but I'm so happy that this person asked it. So the question says, now that we have discussed the cause of a lack of racial diversity, what is the process of reconditioning the mind of minorities in order to engage in activities that are out of their norm? And the reason I'm saying I think we're going to challenge this question, or maybe challenge a premise of this question, is because we really, when we were talking about the framing of this discussion, we said we wanted not to focus as much on what folks of color were not doing, and more focus on how white folks were not, or were marginalizing other people, right? So it's not about we wanted to focus less on reconditioning or reprogramming, as Neil said, because one of the premises is that these values are there, right? They need greater instruction, they need education, but these diverse perspectives on the environment beyond the ones that we use to govern the wilderness parks are there, right? They're there in our cities, they're there in our nations, they're there in diverse communities. And we kind of need to support them. So I'll throw that question out to the other panelists, which is again, this individual said, what is the process of reconditioning the mind of minorities in order to engage in activities that are out of their norm?
Jasmine, do you want to go first, or can I go first?
Yes, so I'll just speak really briefly because as Tom was saying, I don't necessarily think that this is against our norm. I mean, I wanted to touch on even our historical relationship with land. We have more of an honoring relationship with nature. We honor it, we love it, we respect it, and we do have that reciprocity. And you compare and contrast that to the conquering relationship that historically white people have had with the nature. And we're not trying to own it. We're just trying to enjoy it, enjoy its health benefits, and just, coexist with nature and protect it because it protects us. But it's a myth that Black and brown people do not want to be in nature, or this isn't things that we do. That's a myth, because I'm taking people out there all the time and they love it. But go ahead, Simone.
Thank you, Jasmine, for laying that foundation. There's this quote, because I don't know, I'm very expressive. So when I heard the question, my head tilted to the side a little bit because I'm very reactive. And I think even in the question lies in some of the things we need to tackle around, one, referring to folks of color as minorities, too. And then two, also talking about the norm, like whose norm are we talking about? And I think in that question, we have to think about what white supremacist ideals are we talking about when it comes to talking about the outdoors and Black folks' relationship to it, or people of color's relationship to it. And there was this quote that I found, I think it was in an article titled "Black People Don't Go Camping" by Nikki Bregeman. I don't know if I'm saying her last name right, but it reads, "Black people do not have a natural aversion to camping or the great outdoors. We have a natural aversion to racism and abuse." And I think that quote is so perfect, because I don't think that folks of color or people of color, Black and brown folks, need to have their minds reconditioned to doing things outside of their norm. I think white folks really need to take a hard look at what systems, what norms, what language, what barriers are there that keep us out of these spaces. Are we making sure that there is access to these spaces, that there are free shuttles, that there are marketing in low-income communities of color, that there's diverse leadership who can spot the blind spots that are happening in the outdoors? Do we have exhibits that are dedicated to people of color and their history with the land? Do we have exhibitions that are led by folks of intersectional identities? So I think the real reconditioning has to happen with white folks and white leaders in these spaces, and really bringing in the people with this expertise to challenge that and talk about how we bring folks in. Because I think we're at the door, we're nipping at the door. It's just like, let us in and create the conditions to keep us there and not make it feel unsafe. So I think that's my answer to that question.
I think that was extremely well said, Simone. Any other, from the panelists, any other things that you wanted to say around this question of, you know, do white people want different things, and are folks of color marginalized from their relationships?
Wait, can you repeat that one more time?
So just returning to the central, like kind of our third and central question that we've woven into the participant question. Was there anything else that any of the panelists wanted to say about whether white people want different things out of the outdoors? And Neil very poignantly challenged, it's not about wanting, it's really been about having. And the second part of that question is, do white folks marginalize others by enforcing what we might call white values?
Okay, I don't think I got to answer that that question. I think I can speak to my personal experience, because I don't want to speak for all Black people, which is common in a lot of these conversations and spaces sometimes. But for me, I think at the top of the list is seeing, I don't know, not all white folks either, but the idea of escape versus luxury. Like, how, if you do have privilege to have this disposable income and disposable time, honestly, that you can see the outdoors as a luxury, versus me literally being in spaces where I'm a target and criminalized every step of the day, and seeing nature as a way to escape that, a way to really connect back into my body, to feel grounded, to breathe, to dance, to go slow, and not in the way, and not engage with the outdoors in a way to conquer something and be super productive, but also just listen to my body and see what it needs to just be still at the same time. I think living in the city, I love the city also. Like, my local park is also a part of my healing. So it's not just this elitist version of what nature is too, but I'm talking about being able to connect back to by humanity, being in community, and also just being loud without being criminalized. Because in the cities, that happens a lot. We live in a hyper police state. And so the outdoors is my space to kind of step out of that. The things that keep me from actually engaging in those activities and what I need and want out of nature is definitely the microaggressions that happen, the stares, the having to explain myself, why I'm in those spaces, the looks, the fact that some of the spaces are not always communal, that even, I was thinking about it the other day, even the trails, when I went hiking with my partner, I wanted to hike next to them, and there's not even sometimes enough space to walk communally. So imagine if we had this communal ancestral mindset that a lot of people of color take around doing things together, what the trails would look like, what the spots would look like to engage in community with food, with dance, with all this different space. Thinking about rangers and how they can also be part of the police state in the woods as well is another barrier. Even down to what they wear, like, how can we change the uniform or just have folks wear regular clothes to not cause this, I don't know, this aversion when we do see law enforcement in the woods. But yeah, those are the things that I really need out of nature, and then those are some of the barriers that I've seen to me getting those things.
Awesome, thank you, Simone. I'll remind Participants, you are more than welcome to type questions into the Q&A right now. We have Steph from the Experience, from the Adirondack Experience, kind of fielding and funneling those questions into me. So feel free to put them in now. There's one more that I want to get to, but I quickly wanted to respond to something or spin off of something that Simone said, which is that I think in a traditional way of looking at wilderness, like I said earlier, we put wilderness on one side and we put the city on the other. And the city is corrupt, it's dirty, it's not a nice place to be, it's unenvironmental, right? It's not a natural space. And that framing has been carried out through policy, right? Through public policy. Our cities, right, when we carry that framing into our policy, our cities are degraded, overbuilt. Our model of redevelopment in the Rust Belt, for me, I spent most of my adult life in Rust Belt cities, has been to focus on building up the downtown core, right? And that's not the only way to do urban development, right? There's other ways to think about the environment. And so that's why I was saying, and I think it's relevant here, that wilderness and the way we think about our relationship to the outdoors does have implications, huge implications for cities, for urban development. And when we separate those things and really when we try to bring those things together to see the wilderness and urban areas as a continuous landscape, it changes things. It certainly changed things in my program. So I'd just like to get to one other question that was asked here to see what the panelists think. Which is specifically about Leave No Trace. So this participant says, "Hi there, thanks so much for all being part of this. What are your thoughts about the increasing and pervasive messages of Leave No Trace, purported as a common sense natural resource and visitor management tool, but also echoes Moore and others' conservative and romantic sentiments of nature as pristine and absent of humans? So do you see any problems with the messages of Leave No Trace? And do you see any colonialism, is the word that they used, or exclusion embedded therein?"
I'll just begin. I'm in I'll share a story, and in exploring some of our cultural resources, as they call them, in the Adirondacks, and visiting some really old, significant, archaeologically sensitive areas in the park. There have been many folks in the Adirondacks, residents in particular, faculty at colleges, managers of wilderness preserves and state lands, who have sort of nudged me a little bit at times and said, "Hey, you guys were always using this place, right? This idea of wilderness is unfounded. The myth of the pristine is strong today, and in fact, indigenous people were all over this land doing all kinds of things all of the time." And it got me into a situation where I thought, where is this person going? Are they using indigenous use, tenure, and access as an excuse to further degrade the wilderness, to further carry on the extraction? Or were they actually speaking to something more profound, which is building a relationship of respect, acknowledgement, recognition, and embracing the land as our teacher and as our guide to place? And so it's a question that sort of triggering, I guess, might be the word, but I often wonder where people are headed when they ask about, the notion of pristine places, and to essentially bankroll the continued extraction of those places, using this indigenous occupation as proof of human presence on the land. So it's a difficult balance, but ultimately it boils down to, as I mentioned, with the fire and with the gun and the badge, that this is about worldview. This is about ultimately how people conceive of the notion of land.
Thank you for that, Neil. And I feel like that was so well said. And there's a challenge to me in there. There's a challenge of some of the things, just a little bit of a challenge of some of the things that I've been saying, which Neil has always been very, very good at challenging me and giving me great questions. I'll also, along those lines, I'll respond to this question, which is that I stopped teaching Leave No Trace for exactly the reasons that this participant said. But what I found, kind of like what Neil said, or kind of off of some of the ideas that Neil put in my head right there, I found that I really still teach a lot of the same practices when it comes to Leave No Trace. I just frame them differently, right? Instead of framing them as we're having no impact, I frame it as we do this out of a sense of respect, reciprocity. So a lot of the actions are still the same, is what I'm finding at this point in my life, but the framing is different. The language is different. So we have about 1 more minute left. Did either of the other panelists, Jasmine or Simone, want to talk about Leave No Trace?
Yeah, I actually want to make a comment as to what you said regarding reciprocity, because I look at it the same way when I'm out there hiking and I tell people, you know, if I see litter on the trail, I pick it up. And it's because when we're out there, we are taking from Mother Nature, and that's our way of giving back to it, is keeping her clean and, you know, well.
All right, so fantastic. So I think we're supposed to end at 7. Is that correct? Adirondack Experience folks.
It's 8 on our end.
I'm so sorry. I'm in Central Time. 8 on your end. I think yes. Okay, great. So we're going to close it out here. So I think there was a lot of stuff that came together. There's still some loose threads. There's a lot of food for thought for me in this, and I hope you are also getting some ideas to think about. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, all of this will be archived on the website, on the Adirondack Experience, Black Experience in the Outdoors, or Black Experience in the ABK website. So look for more things coming down the line, and thank you all for joining us. Panelists, anything else you want to say as parting words?
I would just say this is the start of the conversation, and I'm looking forward to having more. And if you want more conversations with me and your organization, please check out ors.com, or you can email me at ors@gmail.com. It's OAAARS@gmail.com.
No, Nyala, for everyone tuning in, and I would just say, you know, don't let a race acknowledgement be the end of the line, right? Much like we see land acknowledgements being sort of check the box mentality. Let's not let race acknowledgement be the end of the line here.
Great parting words, right? This is more than just acknowledging privilege. This is about changing. Great. So we'll call it there. Thank you all so much to all the panelists. That was fantastic. Thank you, the Adirondack Experience and the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. And yes, so talk to you later.